The autumn sun over the Nevada desert had a way of making everything look like it was bleeding. It came in low that evening the way it always did in October, painting the sky in shades of burnt copper and deep crimson, turning the flat scrubland along Old Route 66 into something that looked like the end of the world or the beginning of one. The light hit the chrome trim of Cedar Road Diner and scattered into 100 small pieces like something that had been whole once and wasn't anymore. The parking lot was half full. Old pickup trucks, a station wagon with a cracked rear window held together by a strip of duct tape, a faded sedan that had maybe been blue once a long time ago. The kind of cars that belonged to people who ate at places like this. People who came not because the food was exceptional, which it wasn't, but because the coffee was always hot and nobody looked at you like you didn't belong. Helen Decker walked out of the diner at 6:17 in the evening. She walked slowly the way a woman of 78 walks when her knees have been keeping score of every hard year and every cold morning. She carried her purse on her left arm and held her doggy bag with both hands, careful the way people are careful with things they value. She'd ordered the pot roast. She always ordered the pot roast on Thursdays. She'd been coming to Cedar Road Diner every Thursday evening for 11 years, ever since her husband passed and the house got too quiet for dinner alone to feel like anything other than punishment. She didn't notice the group of young men until she was almost at her car. There were 6 of them arranged in a loose half circle near the hood of a black SUV that took up 2 parking spaces. They were in their late 20s, all of them wearing the particular brand of confidence that comes not from having done anything, but from having never been told they couldn't. They had their phones out. They always had their phones out. The one in the center was Brandon Aldridge. He was 28 years old, 6 feet and an inch, with the kind of face that had been handsome enough for long enough that he'd stopped needing to be interesting. He wore a jacket with a private security company logo on the breast pocket. He was watching Helen approach the way a boy watches something small and defenseless before deciding what to do with it. Helen tried to walk past them. She didn't make eye contact. She'd learned in the last few weeks that eye contact only made things worse. She kept her head slightly down and aimed for the driver's side door of her old Buick, thinking only about getting inside, getting the key in the ignition, getting home. She didn't make it. Brandon stepped sideways just enough to put himself between Helen and her car door. His friend shifted with him, effortless, practiced not even a signal exchange between them. "Hey," Brandon said, not loud. He didn't need loud. "Where are you going so fast?" Helen stopped. Her hands tightened around the doggy bag. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "I just need to get to my car." Brandon looked at his friends. One of them was already filming. "You hear that? She needs to get to her car." He said it the way people say things when they're performing for an audience. "This is our spot. You should have picked a different place to park." "I've been parking here for 11 years, Helen said. She shouldn't have said it, not because it wasn't true, but because truth was not what this was about. This was about the particular pleasure some people take in making others feel small, and the fact that it felt better when someone pushed back because then it felt like they'd earned what came next. Brandon smiled. He reached out and with one easy motion knocked the doggy bag out of Helen's hands. It hit the pavement and split open. The pot roast, the mashed potatoes, the little container of green beans she'd asked for on the side, all of it scattered across the asphalt, mixing with gravel and oil and the slow indignities of a parking lot that had seen better decades. Laughter erupted from the group. Not all of them. 2 of the younger ones looked down at their shoes, and in that looking down was something that might have been the beginning of shame if it had been allowed to grow. But Brandon was still smiling, and that smile was the weather system they all lived inside. Helen stood very still. Her lips moved, forming words that wouldn't come. Her arthritic fingers curled inward toward her palm, and she pressed them against her chest, and in that gesture was something heartbreaking, a woman trying to hold herself together with her own 2 hands. The silver bracelet caught the dying light. It was a slender thing, worn smooth from decades of contact with the skin of women who'd worked hard and lived honestly. 3 names were engraved along the inside of the band in small, precise lettering. 3 names from 3 different generations of endurance. Helen had worn it every day since her own mother placed it on her wrist, and her mother had worn it every day since her mother did the same, and the bracelet was in some ways more alive than any of them. It had outlasted them all and kept their names. Brandon looked at it. Then Helen was backing away, fumbling with the clasp on her purse, not even reaching for the spilled food, just trying to get away. And in the rush and the trembling of her arthritic hands, the bracelet slid from her wrist and dropped to the pavement without a sound. She didn't hear it fall. She was already moving, already focused on the Buick, already running the arithmetic of escape. that old women learn to do when they understand that the world has decided they are invisible, except when someone wants to make them feel it. Brandon looked down at the bracelet on the ground. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at his friends with a slow smile, and he bent down and picked it up. He held it between two fingers, turning it in the light. Then he slipped it into the pocket of his jacket, the one over his heart, and patted it once the way a man pats something he's decided to keep. One of his friends laughed. Another filmed. The SUV hummed quietly in its two stolen spaces. Helen got to her car. Her hands shook so badly she couldn't find the door handle on the first try or the second. On the third try, she got it open. She sat down heavily behind the wheel and stared through the windshield at nothing. And she did not cry because she was not a woman who cried easily. She had raised a daughter alone after her husband died, and she had worked 2 jobs for a decade and a half to do it, and she had learned that crying was something you did in private in the dark, when no one could see it, and make it into something they could use. She sat there for a long time. Then she started the car and drove home. And somewhere in the fading Nevada evening, on the other side of town, a Harley-Davidson Road King sat in a garage, and the woman who owned it didn't know yet that her whole world had just shifted. 24 hours earlier, the garage on Mesquite Drive smelled the way good garages always smell: motor oil and old leather, and the kind of honest work that doesn't need to explain itself to anyone. It was Rae Decker's garage, which meant it was also Rae Decker's sanctuary, her workshop, her thinking place. And on the hard nights, the only room in the house where the walls didn't feel like they were closing. She was 58 years old. She had the kind of presence that some women carry into their late 50s, not softened by the years, but refined by them the way metal gets refined, stripped of everything that doesn't belong and left with what does. She was lean and deliberate, with hands scarred in the small ways that hands get scarred when they've spent 30 years doing things that needed doing. Her dark hair was cut close, as shot through with gray at the temples in a way she had stopped noticing years ago. Her face held the lines of Nevada sun and desert wind, and experiences that left marks you couldn't see in photographs, but couldn't miss in person. She wore a white undershirt and a pair of work jeans, and on the wall hook behind her hung the leather vest. The vest was black, worn to the particular softness that only years of use can produce. On the back was the patch that made certain men take a second look and then a second thought. Hell's Angels, Nevada chapter. And below that, in smaller lettering, Road Captain, the designation that meant something specific within the brotherhood, the one who rode point, who knew every road, who was responsible for bringing everyone home. Rae had worn that patch for 21 years. She had been the second woman to earn full colors in the Nevada chapter, and she had earned them the same way everyone else had, through years of riding, years of proving, years of being exactly who she said she was, and nothing less. There had been men who doubted her when she came up. There were always men who doubted. She had found over time that the most effective answer to doubt was not argument, but consistency. You showed up. You did the work. You kept your word. Eventually, the doubting stopped, not because they changed their minds about women, but because they forgot she was anything other than Road Captain. On her right forearm, below the rolled sleeve of her undershirt, was the tattoo that had come first: the eagle, globe, and anchor of the United States Marine Corps. She had served for 22 years. She had gone in at 19 and come out at 41 with a service record that her CO had described at her final review as one of the most consistent he had seen in 3 decades of command. She had served in Desert Storm. She had done 2 tours in Iraq. She had been in places where the heat was different from Nevada heat: heavier, more dangerous, loaded with a particular silence that preceded violence, the way a held breath precedes a scream. She had carried things back from those places that had no name in the language of civilians, and she had learned to live alongside them the way you learn to alongside anything permanent, not by pretending it isn't there, but by finding out what it asks of you and meeting the ask each day. The Harley Road King gleamed even in the dim garage light. She'd bought it in 1995, new off the floor, with the last of her savings and a conviction that some things were worth owning for life. 29 years she'd had this machine. She knew every sound it made, every quirk, every request. She'd rebuilt the engine twice. She'd replaced the pipes, the seat, the handlebars. The bike was the most consistent relationship of her adult life, which said something about the bike and something about her adult life that she preferred not to examine too closely. On the workbench sat a small wooden box. It was old pine, darkened by years of handling, with a small brass hinge she'd replaced twice because the original kept failing. Inside, on a piece of old chamois cloth, was a challenge coin: 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. The coin was heavy for its size, the way things are heavy when they've been earned rather than purchased. The image was worn smooth in the center from years of being held in the dark hours when the weight got bad. She picked it up now out of habit. Semper Fidelis, always faithful. She set it back in the box and returned to the carburetor she'd been cleaning, and the garage was quiet except for the sound of her work and the distant noise of the Nevada evening outside. The phone rang. She always answered on the second ring when it was her mother. Not the first that felt too anxious. Not the third that felt like making her wait. The second ring was the one that said I was here. I've always been here. Hey, Ma. The pause on the other end of the line was 1 second too long. Rae had done 2 combat tours. She had learned to read silence the way other people read faces, by what it contained, by the quality of the air around it. This silence contained something her mother was trying very hard not to show her. Hi, sweetheart. Helen's voice was light, calibrated to sound like nothing was wrong. I was just thinking, maybe I'll stay in tonight. I'm a little tired. Rae set down the carburetor. Ma, she kept her voice even. You love Cedar Road Diner. You go every Thursday. You've gone every Thursday since... I know when I go. So what happened? Nothing happened. I'm just tired. A woman can be tired. A woman can be tired, Rae agreed. But you're not tired. Another silence. This one longer. I dropped something there, Helen finally said. A few weeks ago, Grandma's bracelet. The silver one with the 3 names. A pause. It fell off my wrist when I was leaving. I've been meaning to go back and look for it, but I just haven't gotten around to it. A few weeks ago, Rae was quiet for a moment doing the arithmetic. Her mother went to Cedar Road every Thursday. A few weeks ago meant she had gone back 2 or 3 times since losing the bracelet, or she hadn't gone back at all. And if she hadn't gone back, she'd been eating alone at home and lying about it. Ma, she said carefully, how long have you not been going to the diner? The silence this time was the silence of a woman who knows her daughter too well to think the truth won't come out and loves her too much to make her hear it all at once. 3 weeks, Helen said softly. I haven't been back in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Helen Decker, who had survived widowhood at 46 and 2 jobs at once, and a daughter with nightmares so bad they'd sometimes put holes in walls, this woman had been eating alone in her kitchen for 3 weeks rather than walk back into her favorite restaurant. Tell me what happened, Rae said. She said it quietly, the way you say things when you need to be told something you already know you're not going to like hearing. And slowly, carefully, with the composure of a woman who had decided long ago that falling apart was a luxury she couldn't afford, Helen Decker told her daughter about Brandon Aldridge and his friends, and the booth they always took, and the way they looked at people, and the things they said. She told her about the Tuesday 3 weeks ago, when one of them had knocked her purse off the seat beside her, and the bracelet had slipped off in the confusion, and when she'd looked for it, they'd already left, and she'd never seen it again. She didn't tell her about the week before when they'd said something to her she hadn't repeated to anyone. She didn't tell her about the nightmares. She told her just enough, and Rae heard all the rest of it in the spaces she left empty. When Helen finished, Rae was standing in the center of the garage with her phone pressed against her ear and her free hand wrapped around the edge of the workbench. I'll handle it, she said. Rae, bye. No, please, it's just a bracelet. It's not about the bracelet, Ma. It is about the bracelet, and about an old woman who can handle her own problems. A pause. You know what Deck said? One more incident. I know what Deck said. I don't want you losing the club over this. They've been good to you. They've been your family. Don't throw that away for... She stopped. For what? Rae's voice was still quiet, still even. For my mother. Helen was silent. I'll be careful, Rae said. I promise. After she hung up, Rae stood in the center of her garage for a long time. She picked up the framed photograph from the workbench, her and Helen 2 years ago, sitting in a booth at Cedar Road Diner. Her mother was laughing at something Rae had just said. Really laughing, the kind of laugh that reaches all the way up to the eyes and makes the person doing it look 20 years younger. They both looked like people who had come through hard things and arrived somehow at something good. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in her mother's handwriting, small and precise, the handwriting of a woman who'd been a secretary for 30 years and still believed that how you wrote something said something about who you were. A single sentence. My proudest moment. Not Desert Storm. Not the patch. You. Rae set the photograph down. She put on her leather vest. She checked her phone. Then she grabbed her keys and walked out into the Nevada evening. Cedar Road Diner had been sitting at this particular bend of old Route 66 since 1952. The building was all chrome and glass and faded dreams, the architectural language of a post-war America that had believed with genuine conviction that the future was going to be something spectacular. The neon sign out front had been flickering since at least 1987. Nobody fixed it because Rita Dawson, who had owned the place for 26 years, said it had character, and she meant it, and character meant something to her, even when it was just a sign that needed a new transformer. The walls inside were covered in photographs, black and white mostly, men and women in uniforms spanning from Iwo Jima to Kandahar. Some of them were dead. Most of them were just old. A few still came in on Tuesday mornings for the breakfast special and sat in the same booths they'd been sitting in for 30 years, and Rita brought their coffee before they asked because she'd been bringing their coffee before they asked for decades. Rita Dawson was 64 years old, built like someone who had spent 6 decades arm wrestling life and had never quite lost. Her husband had been Air Force killed in a training accident in 1998 before he ever saw combat, the kind of thing that happened and didn't make sense and never would. She'd taken his benefits and bought this diner and turned it into what it was, a place where veterans felt less like history and more like company. She had done this not because it was profitable, but because it was right. Rae came through the front door at 8:15 on a Wednesday evening. The bell above the door chimed. A few heads turned the way they always did when someone in Hell's Angels colors walked into a room. The awareness that some arrivals matter. Rita was behind the counter. She saw Rae and set down the coffee pot, and the smile she gave her didn't reach her eyes. Something behind those eyes was careful, watchful, doing the math that comes from having a diner on the wrong side of a problem for several weeks. "Wasn't expecting you tonight," Rita said. "I need to ask you about something." "I know what you need to ask me about." She glanced toward the back corner of the empty dining room, then at the security camera mounted above the door. "Come to the back." The office was small and dense, with the particular clutter of a small business run by one person for 26 years. Rita pulled up the security software without being asked and started scrolling through timestamps. "It's been going on for 3 weeks," she said while she scrolled. "Brandon Aldridge and 5 others. They come in around 6 o'clock, always the big corner booth order, barely enough to justify the table, and stay until they feel like leaving. They don't always do something. Sometimes they just sit there and look at people. That's enough." "What do they do when they do something?" "Comments, filming on their phones. Last week they spent 20 minutes staring at old Gus Henderson and laughing quietly until he got uncomfortable and left his dinner half finished." She paused. 2 weeks ago they bumped into Mabel Thornton near the door. Said it was an accident. She fell and broke her wrist. She filed a report. With Shane Aldridge, Brandon's younger brother, who is also our deputy sheriff. You can imagine how that report went. She stopped scrolling, found what she was looking for. "Tuesday evening 3 weeks ago, your mother came in at 6. She pressed play. The footage was black and white, slightly grainy, but it was clear enough. Clear enough for Rae to watch her mother sit alone in the booth with her dinner, looking through the window at the parking lot outside the small, private pleasure of a woman who had made a tradition out of this evening. Clear enough to watch 6 young men approach. Clear enough to watch the one in front lean down and say something that made Helen's face change. The way a light changes when a cloud crosses the sun. Clear enough to watch what happened to the dinner. Rae's hands resting flat on the desk slowly curled into fists. She watched her mother scramble for her purse, watched the bracelet fall from Helen's wrist and hit the floor, watched Helen not notice already moving, already running, and then she watched Brandon Aldridge look down at the bracelet on the floor. She watched him look at it for a long moment, watched him look at his friends with a slow smile, watched him bend down and pick it up, turn it in his fingers, and then not walk to the trash can, not throw it away, but slide it into the breast pocket of his jacket and pat it once. "He kept it," Rae said. Rita nodded. "I didn't want to tell your mother that part. I thought maybe it would be easier. Can I get a copy of that?" She handed Rae a flash drive. Already burned, she'd been waiting. "Rae," Rita looked at her directly. "Victor Aldridge owns this entire block. He has the planning commission. He has friends on the city council. He has his son working as deputy sheriff. Those boys know exactly how protected they are. Nobody stays protected forever. You're on probation with your club. You go after those boys directly, and Dex will have to let you go. You know the rules." "I know the rules," Rae said. She stood up and pocketed the flash drive. She walked back through the diner past the photographs of men and women in their uniforms, and she thought about what it meant that all of these people had stood up when it mattered, and that the world had then largely forgotten about them, except in places like this. She pushed through the front door into the cool October dark. She stood beside her Harley and breathed the counted breath, the deliberate slowdown, that her VA counselor had given her years ago, and that actually worked, which had surprised her. Her phone buzzed. She found the number. Called. Dex Hargrove picked up on the third ring. His voice had the texture of a man who'd spent 30 years outdoors and another 20 in rooms that were too loud, rough, worn to a comfortable smoothness. "Tell me this isn't what I think it is," Dex said. "I need to tell you something," Rae said. "Personal family matter. Might get complicated." "How complicated?" "I don't know yet, but I wanted you to know first." A long silence. "Rae," his voice shifted, more careful, "we gave you one more chance. You know what that means. One more incident, and I have to cut you loose. That's not me wanting to. That's the rules." "I know the rules." "Then what are you telling me?" Rae looked at the Cedar Road diner sign, still flickering in the October dark, still going after all these years because some things keep going even when they should have stopped by any reasonable expectation. "I'm telling you," she said slowly, "that a person is only as good as their word, and I made promises before I ever put on that patch." She paused. "That's what I'm telling you." Dex was quiet for a long moment. "Don't do anything stupid," he finally said, which from Dex Hargrove was about as close to a blessing as you were likely to get. Rae hung up. A voice came from her left. "Miss Decker." She turned. Dana Whitfield was leaning against a cruiser at the edge of the lot, not in uniform, but still wearing her duty belt, the badge not visible. She was 45, compact and careful, with the eyes of someone who had learned not to trust easy answers. "Officer Whitfield, I'm not on duty right now. I'm just a woman standing in a parking lot." She reached into her jacket and produced a plain envelope. Rae took it. "A woman who came across something in the filing system," Dana said, "and thought maybe it belonged somewhere other than where it was. Bank records, Victor Aldridge Development Group. The numbers on some of those transactions don't match any legitimate construction project I can find. Amounts moving in and out of an LLC that doesn't have a business address, doesn't have a contractor's license, doesn't have any employees on record." "Why are you doing this?" Dana was quiet for a moment. "My father was Army, 2 tours in Desert Storm. He taught me that honor means doing the right thing even when it costs you." She looked at the diner. "What's been happening here isn't right, and every report that gets filed ends up in Shane Aldridge's hands." She got in her cruiser and drove away without another word. Rae stood alone in the parking lot with the envelope in one hand and the flash drive in her pocket. She drove home through the Nevada dark, the Harley's engine steady beneath her. In the garage, she set the flash drive on the workbench beside the wooden box. She set the envelope beside it. She opened it and read through the 3 pages slowly, the way you read something you need to understand rather than simply finish. Then she opened her laptop. She typed Victor Aldridge Development Group, Nevada. Press releases, planning commission approvals. A professional photograph. Victor Aldridge in a suit in front of a building bearing his name, smiling the smile of a man who had learned to project confidence the way other people project light. 63 properties in the county. 3 eminent domain proceedings in the last 4 years. A resort development project pending approval. Projected cost $240 million, located along Old Route 66. Rae leaned back. She looked at the screen for a long time, and what she was looking at slowly became something different from what she'd thought it was an hour ago. An hour ago, it had been a problem with some young men who thought cruelty was entertainment and a family connection to the sheriff's department that kept them safe from consequences. That was bad enough. That was bad enough to cost her everything. But this was something else. She picked up the challenge coin, turned it over in her fingers. Semper Fidelis. She looked at the laptop screen again, at Victor Aldridge, smiling in front of his building at the Planning Commission documents at the address of the resort project that sat directly over the ground where Cedar Road Diner had stood since 1952. "All right," Rae said to the empty garage. Outside, the Nevada desert lay quiet and vast and indifferent. A coyote called somewhere in the distance. Rae Decker sat in her garage and began to understand the shape of what was coming, and she did not look away. Doc Harmon lived in a ranch-style house on the western edge of Henderson, the kind of house that a man builds his life around, rather than into practical, unshowy, with a front porch that faced the desert and a garage converted into a medical supply room that still smelled faintly of antiseptic and old rubber tubing. He had come back from the Navy in 1992 with a Navy Cross he kept in a shoebox and a set of skills he'd spent the next 30 years using in ambulances and emergency rooms and twice in the back of pickup trucks on Nevada highways when the ambulance was still 12 minutes away. He was 61 years old, compact and deliberate, with the stillness that comes to people who have spent decades in situations where unnecessary movement gets people killed. He had pulled Rae Decker out of a burning Humvee outside Nasiriyah in 2003, dragging her 40 feet across open ground while the vehicle cooked off rounds behind them, and he had done it without drama or heroics, simply because it was the thing that needed doing, and he was the man in the position to do it. Rae arrived at his house at 7:30 on a Thursday morning. Doc was on the front porch with a mug of coffee and the expression of a man who had seen Rae Decker's truck coming up the road and had already started preparing himself for whatever this was going to be. "Tell me," he said. So she told him. She sat on the porch step and laid it out clean and in order, the way Marines learn to report situation, background assessment, recommendation. Except the assessment kept shifting as she talked, because the more she said out loud, the more she understood that what she'd spent the night thinking was a harassment problem was actually the visible edge of something with a great deal more underneath it. Doc listened the whole way through without interrupting. That was another thing the Navy had given him, the ability to hear a full report before forming a conclusion. When Rae finished, Doc was quiet. "Why this block?" he said finally. "Why these particular people? Why an 80-year-old woman and a man who fixes cars and your mother?" She looked at him. "That's not random cruelty," he said. "Random cruelty doesn't have a schedule." Rae pulled out her phone and showed Doc the Planning Commission documents she'd found the night before. He read them with the careful attention of a man who had spent 4 decades reading medical charts and understood that the important information was often in the numbers rather than the words. "Cedar Road Diner," Doc said, "and everything around it. 6 properties on that stretch, all owned by people who've been there for years, all of them small, all of them the kind of owners who don't have lawyers on retainer." Doc handed the phone back. He looked out at the desert. "You need to talk to Mabel Thornton." Mabel Thornton lived 4 blocks from the diner in a house she had shared with her husband Leonard for 41 years before he died, and that she had continued to share with his memory in the decade and a half since. She was 80 years old and had the bearing of a woman who had once been physically strong and had never entirely stopped being so, even as the years had redistributed the terms. She had been a registered nurse for 4 decades. She had raised 2 children while working night shifts. Her right arm was in a cast to the elbow. She looked at Rae and Doc standing on her doorstep and said, "I wondered when someone was going to come," and stepped back to let them in. She made coffee she didn't drink and sat across from them at the kitchen table and told them about the night 3 weeks ago when she'd been leaving the diner and the group of young men had been blocking the door, and she tried to go around, and the next thing she knew, the ground was coming up very fast and her wrist had hit the concrete in a way that told her immediately before the pain even arrived that something had broken. She told it without self-pity. She had been a trauma nurse. She had a clinical relationship with injury and a philosophical relationship with pain. Then she went to the kitchen drawer and came back with a plain envelope. "This came 8 weeks ago," she said, "before any of the diner business started." Rae took the envelope. Inside was a letter on business stationery with a logo that read Aldridge Development Partners. The letter expressed interest in purchasing her property at what it called a competitive market rate. The figure was 62% of what Mabel knew the property was actually worth. She had declined. 4 weeks later, the incidents at the diner had begun. Rae thought about this on the drive to Earl Pittman's auto shop 2 blocks south of Cedar Road. She thought about schedules and patterns and the arithmetic of intimidation, which was never random. It was strategic. Earl Pittman was 73 years old and had been turning wrenches in the same shop since 1979, the year he'd come back from the Army, and decided that the only machines he wanted to deal with from that point forward were ones that didn't shoot back. He was lean and weathered with the hands of a man who had spent 45 years in contact with things that required care and precision, and those hands were good hands, honest hands, that showed their work. His shop had been vandalized 3 times in the past month. He walked Rae and Doc through it, the broken window in the rear bay, covered with plywood, the spray paint on the south wall painted over, but where the ghost of the letters still showed through if you knew to look, the slashed tires on 2 customer vehicles. "I filed reports all 3 times, Earl said, leaning against a tool cabinet with his arms crossed, his voice carrying the flat tone of a man who had long since stopped expecting the system to function in his direction. "You can probably guess which deputy caught all 3 calls. "Shane Aldridge," Rae said. "Insufficient evidence. Probable teenagers. Nothing actionable." Earl said each phrase the way you say words you've memorized through repetition rather than meaning. "The 3rd time I'd already put a new camera up. hidden one in the rafters where they wouldn't think to look. He led them to a monitor in the back office. He pulled up the file from 3 weeks ago and pressed play. Brandon Aldridge and 3 others. Their faces were clear. They worked methodically, window first, then the paint, then the tires, with the efficiency of people who had planned it carefully. They weren't angry. That was the thing Rae kept coming back to as she watched. They were casual. They talked to each other while they worked, and once Brandon said something that made the others laugh the way you laugh at an inside joke, something with a longer history than this particular night. Earl reached past Rae and paused the footage. "There's something else," he said. He went to the filing cabinet and returned with a manila folder. Inside was a letter from Aldridge Development Partners, the same stationery as the one Mabel had received. And beneath the letter, a document Earl had obtained through a contact at the county clerk's office, a preliminary site survey for a development project covering 6 consecutive properties along the Route 66 corridor, including Cedar Road Diner, Earl's shop, Mabel Thornton's house, and 4 others. The survey was stamped with the logo of a hospitality group based in Las Vegas. A resort project, $240 million in projected development costs. "He needs this whole block," Earl said. "Every last piece of it, and everybody on this block has said no." Rae looked at the survey. She looked at the footage paused on the monitor, Brandon and his friends, in the act of destroying something Earl had spent 45 years building. She looked at Earl's hands wrapped around the edge of the desk, the knuckles slightly enlarged from decades of work. She thought about her mother eating alone in her kitchen for 3 weeks. She thought about Mabel Thornton's broken wrist. She thought about what it meant that a man with $240 million in development plans had decided the fastest path to those plans was to send his son to terrorize elderly people out of their homes and their lives. That evening at 9:15, someone knocked on Rae's front door. She was at the kitchen table with the bank records spread out in front of her, alongside the planning documents, and a notepad tracking numbers and names and the LLC structures that wound through Victor Aldridge's business interests, like a maze designed to make auditors give up from exhaustion. The knock was tentative, not the knock of someone confident in their right to be there. Rae opened the door. The young man standing on the porch looked like he hadn't slept in several days. He was 22 years old, slight, with a face that hadn't finished deciding what it wanted to be. He was wearing a jacket she had seen before in the security footage from the diner, a member of Brandon's group, one of the two who had looked down at his shoes when Brandon knocked Helen's food from her hands. "Ms. Decker," he said, "my name is Jesse Polk." Rae looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the set of his shoulders carrying something heavy enough that he'd stopped trying to hide it. She looked at his eyes, which were not the eyes of someone who had come to threaten or to bargain. She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. Jesse Polk sat at the kitchen table and told Rae everything the way people tell things. When they've finally decided the weight of keeping, it is worse than the weight of letting it go. He had joined Brandon's group 8 months ago, owing Brandon money from a gambling problem that had started small and grown in increments, small enough to seem manageable until they weren't. Brandon had offered him a way to work it off. The work had seemed innocuous, at first company presence filling a booth. He had not understood until it was too late what the group was actually for. He told Rae about Victor Aldridge's instructions, which came through Brandon in language designed to be deniable references to clearing the area, to discouraging the holdouts, to making the block uncomfortable for people who refused to see reason. He told her that the incidents at the diner and at Earl's shop in the letter campaign had been coordinated over months, a deliberate escalation designed to make the remaining property owners feel that staying was more trouble than selling. Then he stopped and looked at his hands and said the thing that changed the shape of everything. "Brandon wears your mother's bracelet every day," Jesse said, "on his wrist. He showed it to me the first week and said it was a reminder that this block was going to be his." He looked up. "I didn't know whose it was then. I know now." Rae was very still for a moment. "What else do you know?" she said. Jesse knew about the money. He had heard enough in 8 months of proximity to Brandon's inner circle to understand that Victor Aldridge's resort project was not financed the way resort projects are supposed to be financed. He had heard names and conversations that stopped when he entered rooms. He had seen Brandon take calls that he stepped outside for, speaking in a tone he never used with anyone local, deferential, and tense, the voice of a man talking to someone whose goodwill he could not afford to lose. He did not know everything, but he knew enough to know that the bank records Dana Whitfield had given Rae were showing something real. Rae sent Jesse home with her phone number and a warning that he was not to speak to Brandon about this conversation. Jesse nodded with the gratitude of a person who has confessed something and found that the other side of confession is unexpectedly bearable. After he left, Rae stood at the kitchen window for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called a number she'd gotten from Dana Whitfield 2 days earlier. Linda Forsythe answered on the second ring. She was 38 years old and worked as a state investigator out of the Carson City office, precise and unsentimental, the voice of someone who dealt in evidence rather than impressions. Rae told her she had something worth looking at and asked for a meeting. She named a truck stop 40 miles outside of Henderson at 7 the following morning. Rae was there at 5 minutes to 7. Linda arrived exactly on time in a dark blue sedan with state plates, wearing a jacket that didn't quite hide the badge on her hip. She was sharp-eyed and still the kind of still that comes from spending years in rooms where the wrong expression at the wrong moment can cost you a case. Rae laid everything out on the table between their coffee cups. The flash drive from Rita's diner camera, the bank records from Dana, the planning documents, Earl's footage, the letter sent to Mabel and Earl, and the other property owners, Jesse Polk's account of the coordination. Linda Forsythe looked at all of it without speaking. She went back to the bank records twice. Victor Aldridge has been on our radar, she said finally. Not for real estate, for the money moving through his construction projects. We've had financial forensics looking at his books for 7 months. She tapped the bank records. These LLCs connect to shell companies we've already identified. This is the same money. How much trouble is he in? Significant trouble if we can prove coordination. She looked up. Here's the problem. What you have: documents, harassment, and property intimidation. Serious crimes. But to bring the kind of charges that put Victor Aldridge away for something meaningful, I need to connect him directly to the money source. I need to show that the harassment campaign is in service of the financial operation. What does that require? Someone on the inside who can establish direct communication between Victor and the source of the money. Someone with direct knowledge who's willing to testify. She paused. Without that, we have a case that gets Brandon Aldridge some probation and gets his father's lawyers very busy for about 6 months before everything goes away. Rae drove back to Henderson in the kind of thinking silence that requires all of your attention. Someone on the inside. She thought about that for the rest of the day and into the evening, and she was still thinking about it when Dana Whitfield called her at 10 o'clock that night. I found something else, Dana said. She was whispering. In the archived files. A record that should have been flagged and wasn't. A pause. Rae Victor Aldridge has been paying off a debt that belongs to Shane. Well, Rae said nothing. 4 years ago, Shane Aldridge had a problem, a serious one, the kind that ends careers and sometimes ends freedom. Victor made it go away, paid the people involved, made sure the records were buried. Another pause. Shane didn't ask him to do it. Victor did it and then told him afterward. And then Shane had a debt that could never be repaid in money because it wasn't about money. Rae understood what she was being told. Shane Aldridge was not a corrupt cop in the way that corrupt cops usually are. Shane Aldridge was a man whose father had performed a kindness that was actually a trap and who had been living inside that trap ever since, unable to walk away, because walking away meant surrendering the thing Victor had purchased on his behalf, and unable to do his job with integrity, because doing his job with integrity meant doing it against his own father. It was an old kind of cruelty. The cruelty of the person who provides what you need and then collects forever. The next morning, Rae went to Cedar Road Diner. Brandon Aldridge and his group were in the corner booth. Brandon looked up when she walked in and something moved across his face. Not fear exactly, but the awareness of a man who has been in control of a situation and has just seen that situation develop a variable he hadn't accounted for. Rae sat down across from him. She laid Earl's footage documentation on the table. She did not raise her voice. She kept her hands visible and her tone level because this was not about anger. It had never been about anger. It was about the thing underneath anger, which was clarity. She laid out what she had. The planning documents, the letters to Mabel and Earl and the others, Jesse's account of the coordination, the bank records. She laid it out the way a Marine lays out a map before a mission complete, ordered without embellishment. Brandon listened with the stillness of a man hearing something he cannot immediately find an angle on. His face moved through stages, contempt first, then uncertainty, then something adjacent to fear. The bracelet on his left wrist caught the light from the diner window. Rae looked at it. Brandon followed her eyes. He pressed his left arm slightly against his side, a small, unconscious movement, the movement of someone protecting something they have no right to. The bracelet, Rae said. Give it back. Brandon's jaw tightened. I don't know what you're... Don't. Her voice was quiet, final. We both know what it is and where it came from. Give it back and walk away from this block, and I handle the rest through channels that don't require either of us to be in the same room. For a long moment, Brandon did not move. Then he stood up, not to comply to end the conversation. This isn't over, he said. No, Rae agreed. It isn't. She watched Brandon walk out of the diner with the bracelet still on his wrist, and she sat for a moment with the weight of what had not happened yet pressing against her chest. She drove home without calling Helen. There was nothing to tell her yet. The bracelet was still out there. She had not yet done the things she had promised to do. She got home at 9:15. The garage was burning. Not a large fire, not yet, but the particular terrifying speed of a fire that has had time to establish itself. Orange and black, climbing the south wall, eating through the wood with a sound like something living. The smell hit Rae before she even got out of the truck. Accelerant. Someone had wanted this to catch. She grabbed the fire extinguisher from behind the seat and she fought it the way she'd fought every hard thing in her life, methodically without panic, one section at a time. She went through 2 full extinguishers before the fire was out, and by then her eyes were burning and her throat was raw, and the south wall of the garage was a blackened skeleton and the workbench was gone. The photograph was gone. The wooden box was gone. The challenge coin that had sat in that box for 35 years, that had traveled with her from Nevada to the Saudi desert to the Iraqi interior and back, was ash that shifted in the dry desert air when she crouched down beside it. She found the note outside, anchored under a rock near the garage door. It was typed. No identifying marks. Back off. Or next time it's her house. Rae crouched beside the ash and the note in the thin morning light and felt something happen inside her that had nothing to do with rage and everything to do with clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when a situation stops pretending to be something manageable and shows you its actual shape. She heard a car, a single vehicle moving slowly up the drive, a Mercedes black and recent, out of place the way expensive things are out of place in neighborhoods where everything has been earned rather than bought. It stopped 20 feet from where she was crouching. The engine went quiet. The door opened. Victor Aldridge was 55 years old, and he looked tonight like he had aged 10 years in the last week. The suit was right. The suit was always right, impeccable and dark, the armor of a man who had built his entire life on the impression of controlled competence. But above the suit, the face was wrong. It was the face of a man who had set something in motion that had gone very far past the point, also where he knew how to stop it. He walked toward Rae slowly. He stopped 8 feet away, looking at the burned wall of the garage, looking at the ash. "Ms. Decker," he said, his voice was hoarse, "I need you to listen to me." "I don't have much reason to listen to you," Rae said. "I know that." Victor reached into his jacket pocket and produced his phone. He held it out, the screen facing her. On it was a photograph, Brandon Aldridge sitting in his car, photographed from outside through the driver's window, and overlaid on the image was a red targeting reticle, the kind that appears in the viewfinder of a precision rifle scope. Rae looked at the photograph. She looked at Victor. "The people I've been working with," he said, "the money I've been moving through the construction projects, I thought I understood what I was involved in. I thought it was a financial arrangement. I thought I could manage it and walk away when I was ready." He closed his eyes briefly. "I was wrong. They don't operate that way." "How do they operate?" "They gave me 48 hours. Either I deliver the land the whole block cleared and ready deed transfers complete, or they recover their investment another way." He looked at the burned wall. "They're the ones who sent someone here tonight. Not Brandon. Not me. They're done waiting." His voice cracked at the edge of a word. "They sent me other photographs. Shane, my ex-wife, Brandon in his car." He put the phone back in his pocket. "They'll work through everyone connected to me, and then they'll work through everyone standing between them and that land." Rae looked at him for a long time. In the distance, something moved across the desert, a hawk hunting in the early morning thermals, tracing long, slow circles above the scrubland. Patient, purposeful, without mercy. "Your problem," Rae said quietly, "not mine." "Your mother's house is on that list," Victor said. "Rita Dawson's diner, Mabel Thornton, Earl Pittman, every person who owns property on that block. They're not just talking about forcing sales anymore. They're talking about making it look like accidents." He held her gaze. "I came to you because I have nobody else to go to, because everyone else I could go to is either already compromised or already afraid." A pause. "And because you're the only person I've encountered in this entire situation who seems to be more afraid of doing nothing than of doing something." Rae crouched back down and looked at what remained of the wooden box that had held her challenge coin for 35 years. She stood up. "Go home," she said to Victor Aldridge. "Don't talk to Brandon. Don't make any calls. Don't do anything until I contact you." She held his eyes. "Can you do that?" Victor looked at her with the eyes of a man who has run out of every other option. "Yes," he said. She waited until the Mercedes was gone. Then she stood in the ruins of her garage and looked at the space where 40 years of her life had been, not all of it gone, but enough. The parts that had held the weight of memory and service and the particular comfort of things you know are yours. She thought about Shane Aldridge sitting inside a cage his father had built around him with careful hands and a check that had seemed like salvation. Someone on the inside who's willing to testify. She got in her truck. She drove across town in the thin morning light, through streets still quiet past the diner, still dark past the stretch of Route 66 that two different men wanted badly enough to burn things down for. And she thought about what it cost to stand up and what it cost to stay sitting, and how the arithmetic of those two things worked out differently, depending on whether the thing you were protecting was yours alone or belonged to someone who couldn't protect it themselves. She parked in front of a small house on the north side of town. She went to the door. She knocked. A light came on inside. Footsteps. The door opened. Shane Aldridge was 26 years old, and he had his brother's face but different eyes. Eyes that had been through something that Brandon's hadn't. Something that had taken the edge off the confidence and replaced it with a vigilance that never fully rested. He was still in uniform, fresh off a late shift. His hand went to the butt of his service weapon when he saw who was standing at his door. Rae kept her hands visible, relaxed at her sides, the stance of a person who has nothing to hide and a great deal to say. "Your father is going to let you take the fall for everything," she said. "Every report you buried, every complaint you lost, every night those boys were out on that block with your badge making sure nobody stopped them." She let that settle. "When this comes apart, and it's coming apart, Shane, it's already started, he's going to need someone to absorb the consequences. And he's going to make sure it's you." Shane stared at her. He didn't say anything. He didn't deny it. He didn't reach for the weapon. He stood in the doorway of his house in his uniform at 11:30 at night and looked at Rae Decker with the eyes of a man hearing out loud something he has been unable to say to himself. The door did not close. Rae waited. Shane Aldridge did not invite Rae inside immediately. He stood in the doorway for a long time, long enough that the night air moved between them and a dog somewhere down the block finished whatever it had been saying to the dark. He stood there with his hand no longer on his weapon, which was something, and with his face doing the complicated work of a man watching the last version of a story he's been telling himself come apart. Then he stepped back from the door. The house was spare and clean, in the way that men keep houses when they haven't yet decided to stay somewhere, furniture that was functional, rather than chosen walls with no photographs, a kitchen counter with nothing on it but a coffee maker and a single mug. The house of a man living temporarily for several years waiting for a life that kept not arriving. Shane sat at the kitchen table. Rae sat across from him. For a while, neither of them spoke. "He told me he did it because he loved me," Shane said finally. His voice was flat and careful, the voice of someone reciting something they had memorized rather than felt. 4 years ago, when everything happened, he said he didn't want to see me lose everything over a mistake. He looked at the table. I believed him for about a year. Then I understood what it actually was. What was it? Insurance. Shane looked up. He needed someone inside the department, someone who would answer when he called. He picked his own son because his own son was the one person he could be certain would never go public. A pause. He was right about that too. For 4 years he was right. But not anymore, Rae said. Shane met her eyes. Something moved in them, not quite relief, but the beginning of a weight being transferred. "I've been recording things," he said, "since about 18 months in, when I started to understand that there was going to come a day when he needed someone to absorb what had accumulated, and that someone was going to be me. I have conversations between my father and me going back 2 years. I have a meeting at the house 8 months ago with 2 men I didn't recognize then, but I ran the plates on their rental car and sent the results to a private email account I set up for exactly this purpose." He paused. "I have enough." "Enough for what?" "Enough to put him away." He said it without inflection, without visible emotion. The way you say something you have had to practice saying until it stopped sounding like the worst thing you have ever said. And enough to connect the money, the shell companies, the construction invoices that don't match any real work, the accounts that receive transfers from LLCs that don't exist. I'm not a financial investigator. I don't understand all of it, but I understood enough to keep records. Rae thought about Linda Forsythe sitting in the truck stop 40 miles away, someone on the inside who's willing to testify. There's a state investigator, Rae said. She's been building a case. What you have would complete it. Then let's complete it, Shane said. The simplicity of a man who has been waiting for a door to open and has finally stopped being surprised that it looks nothing like he imagined. He got up and went to the bedroom and came back with a USB drive that he set on the table between them, small, ordinary, containing everything that was going to dismantle the careful architecture of Victor Aldridge's life. Rae picked it up. She turned it over once in her fingers, feeling the weight of it, which was not physical weight, but the other kind. You understand what this means for you, she said. It was not a question. I understand, Shane said. I've understood for a year and a half. I've been waiting for someone to come to the door. He looked at her steadily. I'm glad it was you. Linda Forsythe arrived at Rae's house at 5 in the morning with FBI Special Agent David Warren, who was 44 years old and had the squared-off patience of a man who had spent 2 decades watching complicated situations resolve themselves into simple ones, given enough time and enough evidence. Warren had driven through the night from the Las Vegas field office because Linda had called him at midnight and told him she had something he needed to hear. They sat at Rae's kitchen table, and Shane Aldridge walked them through 22 months of careful documentation, while the Nevada desert outside the window went from black to purple to the tentative gray of early morning. Warren listened with the stillness of someone trained not to react to things that would make an ordinary person react. When Shane finished, Warren looked at Linda, and Linda looked at Warren, and something passed between them that was the professional equivalent of a slow exhale. The 2 men from the meeting, Warren said, the plates you ran. He named 2 names, slowly looking at Shane carefully. Shane nodded. Warren sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. We've been tracking a Sinaloa-connected operation moving money through Nevada construction projects for 11 months. We had the financial side. We didn't have the human connection. He looked at Rae. Your evidence ties it together. How long to get warrants? Rae White asked. 48 hours, maybe 36. Warren looked at his watch. We'll need Shane in federal protective custody starting now. We'll need the other witnesses secured. He looked at the organized documentation Shane had compiled with the meticulous care of a man building the case that would save and destroy his life in equal measure. Ms. Decker, I want to be honest with you about the scope of what this has become. Victor Aldridge's financial exposure connects to a cartel operation that does not negotiate. When they learn that we're moving, and they will learn before we can stop them from learning, they will attempt to protect their investment. He looked at her directly. That means everyone whose testimony or existence threatens that investment becomes a target. The morning light was coming in through the kitchen window, now thin and pale. Rae thought about 17 properties on a stretch of old Route 66, about an 80-year-old woman with a broken wrist in a chest of her husband's medals from a war 50 years gone, about a man who had been fixing cars in the same building since 1979, about Rita Dawson in the photographs on the walls and the coffee that was always hot, about her mother sitting in her kitchen alone for 3 weeks because she had been afraid to walk into the restaurant she loved. Consolidate the targets, Rae said. 1 location easier to secure than 17. Better defensive position. If they're coming anyway, we choose the ground. Warren looked at her. You're talking about drawing them in. I'm talking about not letting them pick their moment and their location, which is what they'll do if we try to scatter people across a county. She looked at Warren steadily. You said 48 hours for warrants and federal coordination. That's 48 hours when everyone connected to this is vulnerable. I'd rather be vulnerable in 1 place with people I trust around me than vulnerable in 17 places alone. Warren was quiet, where Rae looked at the window. Outside, the Nevada morning was arriving slow and inevitable, the way mornings always arrive regardless of what the night before contained. Where it started, she said. By noon, Rae had made 8 phone calls. By 2 in the afternoon, Helen Decker had packed a small bag and was sitting in the undamaged front section of Cedar Road Diner with a cup of coffee that Rita had brewed on the camping stove she kept for power outages. When Rae had told her what was happening and what might happen before it was over, Helen had looked at her daughter for a long moment and then picked up her bag and walked to the truck without a word. On the way out of her house, she had stopped and touched the doorframe the way you touch something you love when you're not certain you'll see it again. Earl Pittman arrived at 2:30 with an overnight bag and a calm that Rae recognized as the equanimity of old soldiers who have been in enough situations that the anticipation of danger no longer registers as something separate from the danger itself. He shook Ray's hand and found a chair and asked Rita if there was more coffee. Mabel Thornton arrived at 3, and when Ray told her she could go somewhere else if she wanted somewhere safer, Mabel looked at her with the expression of a woman who had been a trauma nurse for 40 years and had run toward emergencies while other people ran away, and said with great politeness that she would stay where she was needed, thank you. Jesse Polk came at 4. He sat in the corner with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on the door, and when Ray looked at him, he nodded once and she nodded back. Doc Harmon had set up a makeshift medical station in the back section of the diner by the time Dex Hargrove arrived at 5 in the morning of the following day with 6 Hells Angels behind him. They came in through the back and moved through the diner the way people move through spaces when they are assessing it for this kind of purpose, measuring angles, identifying positions, noting exits. They did not speak much. They didn't need to. Dex found Ray at the front window. "Shut up," Dex said before she could speak. "Before you say whatever you're about to say about the club and the probation and the rules." He stood beside her and looked out at the empty parking lot in the early morning dark. "You're our road captain. We're here because you're our road captain. The rest of it we'll sort out when this is over." A pause. "Now tell me what you need." Linda Forsythe arrived at noon with Warren and 4 state troopers and the information that federal warrants had been issued for Victor Aldridge and that the FBI had attempted to move on the cartel cell and had found their primary location empty. They had moved. They knew something was coming. Warren handed Ray a tactical radio. "But I'm leaving these 4 troopers with you. If it comes to it, call this channel and every federal asset in the county converges here." He looked around this diner, the old men and the old women and the bikers and the retired corpsman with his medical kit and the young man in the corner who had chosen the harder thing. He looked at the photographs on the walls. "You understand that I am not officially endorsing this strategy." "I understand," Ray said, "and you understand that if something goes wrong in here—" "Warren," Linda said quietly. He stopped. She looked at Ray. "We'll be close as we can be." She looked at her the way you look at someone when you want to say something and have decided the saying of it would take longer than either of you has right now. "Be careful." The afternoon moved slowly. The sun tracked across the Nevada sky in its long October arc, and the light through the diner windows changed by degrees from the flat brightness of midday to the amber warmth of late afternoon to the deep copper of early evening. Rita kept the coffee going on the camping stove. Mabel Thornton and Helen Decker sat together in the front booth and talked in the quiet voices of women who have both outlived things that should have outlasted them, and Ray, watching them from across the room, felt something that was too large to name and too important to look away from. Doc checked on everyone twice and said nothing that wasn't necessary and was everything that was. At 6:15, Ray's phone buzzed. The text was from an unknown number with a local area code and the stripped-down efficiency of someone who did this professionally. "Send out Jesse Polk. Everyone else walks." Ray read it twice. She showed it to Linda, who was already on the radio. Ray walked across the diner to where Jesse sat. Jesse looked up and read her face and understood what the text had said without being told. "Okay," Jesse said. He started to stand. "Sit down," Ray said. He looked at her. "I said sit down." Her voice was not loud. It carried anyway the way her voice had always carried, with the weight of a person who learned to speak in situations where being heard was a matter of survival. "You came to me because you wanted to do the one right thing available to you. I'm not going to let the one right thing available to me be using you as a trade." She held his eyes for a moment. "You stay here. You stay with Doc." She walked to the front door. Helen looked up from the booth where she and Mabel had been sitting. Ray met her eyes. She did not say anything. Helen did not say anything either. She reached across the table and took Mabel Thornton's hand and held it with the steady grip of a woman who has decided that the only response to fear is to find the thing you love most in the room and hold on to it. And Ray thought, watching her, that she had spent her whole life trying to be worthy of the way her mother faced the world, and that she wasn't certain she had succeeded, but that tonight she was going to try. She pushed through the front door. The parking lot was full dark now, the Nevada sky above it vast and star-filled in the way that skies over deserts are star-filled, as if the emptiness of the land below requires the sky to compensate with an excess of light. Ray walked to the center of the lot and stopped and raised her hands, palms out, the universal language of someone who has come to talk rather than to act. For a moment there was nothing. Then headlights. 3 black SUVs, the same make and model, pulling into the lot from the north entrance and fanning out in the slow, deliberate pattern of people who know how to use vehicles as tactical cover. They stopped 40 feet out. Engines died. Doors open. 12 men. They moved with the economy of people who have done this work long enough that the steps have become automatic. Body armor, weapons that had not been manufactured for the civilian market. The kind of equipment that tells you without further elaboration that the people carrying it are not here to negotiate in good faith. Their leader stepped forward. He was perhaps 45 with a scar along the left side of his face that had badly healed, without medical care, which told Rae something about the man's history. He moved with the deliberate ease of someone who has been in enough dangerous situations that this one does not register as exceptional. Ms. Decker, his English was precise. We have no issue with you personally. Send out Jesse Polk and this ends cleanly. I can't do that, Rae said. The man looked at her with the patient expression of someone explaining something to a person who has not yet understood the essential facts of their situation. You have 6 motorcyclists, 4 state troopers, and a room full of elderly civilians. We have 12 professionals. You understand the arithmetic. I understand the arithmetic, Rae said. Tunnel. I've done worse arithmetic in worse places. She was buying time. Every word was time. Every second was the rapid response team getting closer. The FBI net tightening warrants being executed. She kept her hands visible and her voice even, and she thought about the challenge coin that was ash in her burned garage, about the motto that had been on it, about what always faithful actually means when you strip away the ceremony and the comfortable distance and get down to the moment when the words are required to be true. She heard the diner door open behind her. She did not turn immediately. She kept her eyes on the cartel leader, on the 12 men fanned out behind the SUVs, on the tactical geometry of the situation. Another variable had entered the picture. She needed a second to account for it before she could look at it. Then she turned. Brandon Aldridge was 28 years old and his arms were still bandaged from the fire that had happened to his car 4 days ago, when the cartel had decided that Victor's son was a liability rather than an asset, and had demonstrated that decision in the clearest possible language. He was pale, and the confidence that had been the defining feature of every interaction Rae had ever witnessed him in was gone, replaced by something more difficult to define. The specific gravity of a man who has finally stopped moving and turned to face the direction of what he has done. He was wearing a white shirt. On his left wrist was the silver bracelet. He crossed the parking lot and stood beside Rae. She looked at him. Brandon did not look back at her. He was looking at the cartel leader with the clear, steady eyes of a man who has nothing left to protect except the thing he should have been protecting all along. Then slowly he reached up with his right hand and unclasped the bracelet from his wrist. He held it for a moment. 3 names in the silver worn smooth, with the handling of hands that had earned the right to wear it. 3 generations of women who had survived things that should have broken them and had not broken them because they had chosen each morning not to be broken. The bracelet had been on his wrist for weeks, and he had worn it the way you wear a thing when you want to feel like it belongs to you. And in those weeks, he had learned that some things refuse to belong to the wrong person, no matter how long you hold them. He placed it in Rae's hand. Rae felt the weight of it, small weight, enormous weight, the kind that has nothing to do with the metal and everything to do with what the metal has witnessed. I wore it like it meant something to me, Brandon said. His voice was steady in the way of something that has cost a great deal to make steady. It doesn't. It never did. He turned to face the cartel leader. You want someone responsible for what happened on this block. I'm responsible. I ran the harassment campaign. I followed my father's instructions and made them worse because I thought I was helping him. He reached into his back pocket and produced his phone. And I am prepared to stand in a federal courtroom and testify to every conversation, every instruction, every financial arrangement I have knowledge of. My father's accounts, the shell companies, the money. All of it. The cartel leader looked at him with mild professional interest. Your father's debt. My father's debt is my father's problem, Brandon said. But if you're calculating what it costs you to let this go tonight versus what it costs you to see everything I know become public record in a federal prosecution, I think you know which number is bigger. Rae closed her fingers around the bracelet. She stood in the center of the parking lot with the silver worm in her fist, and for a moment she was not thinking about the cartel or the FBI or the tactical situation. She was thinking about a Thursday evening in October and a plate of pot roast on a parking lot floor and an old woman's hands pressed against her chest trying to hold herself together. She was thinking about a promise. A silence settled over the parking lot. Then from the north end headlights, from the south more. The FBI rapid response vehicles that Warren had positioned 15 minutes out had been moving for the last 8 minutes since the moment Rae had stepped through the diner door because Linda Forsythe had watched her walk out and had immediately reached for her radio. 2 black vans from the north, 3 more from the south. State police units filling the side streets. The sound of a helicopter somewhere above the darkness, its beam not yet deployed, but present audible, a reminder that the sky belonged to someone with more resources than 12 men in a Nevada parking lot. The cartel leader looked at the vehicles. He looked at Rae. He looked at Brandon, who had not moved, who was still standing with his bandaged arms and his white shirt and the clear eyes of a man who has made his decision and intends to live in it. The leader made a sound that was not quite a word. His men began to move not toward the diner, but away toward the tree line at the back of the property. 3 of them didn't make it to the trees. FBI agents and state troopers converged from 3 directions, and the night filled with shouted commands and the sounds of professional law enforcement doing the work it does best when it is uncorrupted and appropriately resourced. 2 of the 3 surrendered immediately. The third, the leader with the badly healed scar, went down hard in the dry Nevada scrub at the edge of the parking lot, and the sound he made going down was the sound of a situation concluding. Then it was quiet, the particular quiet that follows violence, which is not the same as peace, but is the closest thing to it available in the immediate aftermath. Rae opened her hand. The bracelet lay in her palm, one link slightly bent. The clasp worn from decades of use, and then from weeks against a stranger's skin, someone who had taken it as a trophy and had learned too late that you cannot take what was never available to be taken. The silver was tarnished from the wearing, but the 3 names were there, still clear, still present. The names of 3 women who had carried this thing through different hardships and different losses and had kept going because that was what the women in this family did and had always done and would continue to do as long as the line held. She did not move for a long moment. She just stood there with the bracelet in her hand and let it be what it was, not an ending, not a victory, but a restoration. The return of something that should never have been taken. The proof that some promises, if you are willing to pay what they cost, can actually be kept. Doc Harmon appeared at her elbow with the corpsman's ability to materialize exactly where he was needed. He looked at her in the way that people who have survived dangerous things together look at each other afterward, taking inventory, making sure the other one is whole. "You good?" he said. "Yeah," Rae said. She was not entirely sure that was true yet, but she was going to make it true. She had practice with that particular project. She walked back through the diner door. Helen was standing. She had moved from the booth to the center of the room, and she stood with Mabel Thornton's hand in hers. And when Rae came through the door, she looked at her daughter with the eyes of a mother who has spent 58 years loving someone and finds at the end of every hard thing that the love is still there, still intact, which is itself a kind of miracle when you consider everything the hard things take. Rae crossed the room to her. She opened her hand. Helen looked at what was in her daughter's palm for a long moment without speaking. Then she reached out with her free hand, the arthritic fingers that curled inward at the knuckles that had pressed against her chest in a parking lot 6 weeks ago when she was trying to hold herself together, and she lifted the bracelet from Rae's hand with a steadiness that had nothing to do with the physical condition of her hands and everything to do with who she had always been. She looked at it. She looked at the 3 names. She turned it over once. The way you handle a thing you thought was gone forever and need to verify is real. Then she put it on. The clasp engaged with a small, precise sound, the sound of a thing returned to its rightful place, of a loss undone, of a promise kept in the only way promises can ultimately be kept, which is through the willingness to pay whatever the keeping costs. Helen looked up at her daughter. She put her arms around Rae, the way mothers hold their children when the holding is doing the work that words cannot do. And Rae Decker, who had been a United States Marine for 22 years and a Hells Angels road captain for 21, and a woman who had spent the better part of 4 decades learning to carry weight without letting it show, stood in the middle of Cedar Road Diner and let herself be held by her 78-year-old mother, and felt something in her chest release that had been locked in place for longer than she had allowed herself to know. Outside, the Nevada night went about its business. Warren coordinated on 3 radios simultaneously. Linda Forsythe stood near the tree line reviewing documentation on her phone, the warrants executing in real time the architecture of Victor Aldridge's carefully constructed life, coming down with the clean inevitability of things that were always going to come down once someone decided to push. Victor Aldridge was arrested at his home at 11:17 that night. He did not resist. He sat down when they told him to sit down, and he looked at the wall of his study, the framed commendations, the photographs with politicians, the architecture of a life built on the impression of respectability. And he looked at it all with the expression of a man seeing it for the first time from the outside. Shane Aldridge was not arrested. The federal prosecutor, working with Linda Forsythe through the night and into the early morning, reviewed Shane's documentation and his testimony and made the determination that a man who had preserved evidence of his own father's crimes at personal risk for nearly 2 years was something other than a co-conspirator. The legal language for what Shane was would be worked out over the following months. The human language for it was simpler and arrived sooner: a son who had been made into a weapon and had chosen at the cost of everything familiar to him to stop being one. The verdicts came 4 months later. Victor Aldridge received 22 years in federal prison. The judge read the sentence in the tone that federal judges use when they want the length to carry the full moral weight of what it represents, not bureaucratic, not procedural, but unambiguous. The voice of an institution that still believed on its best days that accountability was possible and that the belief was worth maintaining. The charges covered racketeering, conspiracy, money laundering, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit intimidation against protected persons. The legal language for what had been done to Helen Decker and Mabel Thornton and Earl Pittman and the others over the months before any of this had become a federal case. Brandon Aldridge received 3 years and 5 years of supervised probation. The judge acknowledged his cooperation, acknowledged the moment in the parking lot, which had been captured on 4 different cameras and reviewed in detail by everyone involved, all of whom had come to the same conclusion about what it represented. Not a calculation, not a strategy, but a choice made at the moment when choices are most difficult, which is when they are most real. The judge told Brandon that 3 years was not a gift. It was an opportunity. Whether he understood the difference would be demonstrated over the years that followed. Kyle Brennan, Shane Aldridge. He resigned from the sheriff's department 6 weeks after his testimony was concluded. He did not have a plan for what came next. He had spent so many years living inside someone else's plan that the absence of one felt both terrifying and, underneath the terror, like the first clear air he'd breathe in a very long time. He got a job at a hardware store on the east side of Henderson and worked his shifts and came home to his sparse house and slowly over months began to put things on the walls. The cartel soldiers who survived received federal sentences measuring in decades. The Sinaloa-connected operation in Nevada was dismantled over the following months, the work of federal law enforcement moving through shell companies and financial networks, and the human connective tissue that held those systems together. It was slow work, and it was not complete in any satisfying narrative sense, because these things are never complete that way, but it was genuine work, and it produced genuine results. Cedar Road Diner reopened on a Saturday morning in April, 6 months after the night in the parking lot. Rita Dawson had rebuilt the back section with help from Earl Pittman and 2 of Dex Hargrove's people, who turned out to have construction skills that exceeded what their day-to-day presentations suggested. The old photographs had been cleaned and reframed, hung in the same positions they had always occupied. Several new ones had been added, including one of Helen Decker and Rae, taken on the morning of the reopening, standing in front of the restored neon sign. Helen's hand was raised slightly in the way of a woman who wants you to see what she is wearing on her wrist, and in the photograph, her face wore the kind of smile that reached all the way up to the eyes, the real kind, the kind that makes the person doing it look 20 years younger. The diner's colors were restored. Dex Hargrove had brought the chapter's patch ceremony to the parking lot, returning Rae's colors in front of everyone who had stood with her that night. He placed her vest back on her shoulders himself. The chapter voted unanimously not just to reinstate her, but to formally create a new position, council. The one who would help younger members understand that the patch was not a symbol of power over others, but of responsibility toward them. That strength without compassion was tyranny. That the measure of a person was not how many feared them, but how many they helped when no one was watching. Dex said it simply in the way Dex said most things: "You showed us what the colors mean. Not just the ones on your back, all of them." The town came that April morning. Veterans and civilians, old and young people, who had been too afraid to speak up during the months of the Aldridge campaign, and people who had spoken up and been ignored, and people who had simply been living their lives and found in the aftermath that those lives had been changed by something they had watched from a distance. They came for the coffee and the pot roast and for the comfort of a place that had refused to become something it wasn't, and they sat in the booths and talked to each other the way people talk when they have recently been reminded that they are a community. Mabel Thornton's cast had come off 2 months prior. She sat with Helen in the front booth, and they drank their coffee and watched the room fill. And Mabel said something that made Helen laugh, the real laugh, the one that reached the eyes. 18 months after the night in the parking lot, Rae Decker was running an organization called Veterans Against Harassment out of a small office on the south side of Henderson. It was not a large organization. It had 4 permanent staff, all veterans, and a network of volunteers, and it worked on cases that looked like the Cedar Road situation. Elderly people and small property owners being pressured and intimidated by interests larger than themselves. Cases that fell through the gaps of the legal system, not because the system was entirely broken, but because the system required someone to know where to push and how to push and what to do when the pushing produced a door that wouldn't open through ordinary means. Rae was that person along with the team she had built, and she was good at it in the way that people are good at things that came from necessity rather than ambition. On a Tuesday morning in November, 18 months in, she was sitting at her desk going through intake forms when there was a knock at the office door. Brandon Aldridge was 29 years old and looked like someone who had spent a year and a half in federal custody, thinking very carefully about the difference between who he had been and who he intended to be. He was thinner, and something in his face had changed in a way that was difficult to name, less polished but more substantial, like material that had been stripped of its coating and found to have genuine structure underneath. He stood in the doorway and looked at Rae. "I don't know if this is appropriate, coming here. I understand if you want me to leave." "Sit down," Rae said. Brandon sat. He looked at his hands on the desk. The scars from the car fire had faded to thin silver lines, not entirely unlike the engraving on a certain bracelet. "I've been thinking about what I want to do when the probation ends," he said. "What I want to build." He looked up. "I want to do something that makes some of what I did less." He stopped. Started again. "I'm not looking for absolution. I understand that's not how it works." He held her eyes. "I just want to spend the rest of my life going in the other direction." Rae looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the things you carry and the things you put down, and the question of whether putting something down was the same as releasing it, or whether release was a different process entirely longer and less linear, requiring something from you every morning rather than only once. She thought about what her mother had said to her once years ago, the first time the nightmares had been bad enough, that Helen had called before dawn and just talked to her about nothing in particular, just talked until the thing pressing on Rae's chest eased enough to breathe. Helen had said the only thing that helps is forward, not because the past gets smaller, because you get bigger. "Redemption isn't a destination," Rae said. "It's a choice you make every morning." She held Brandon's eyes. "You make it when you don't feel like it. You make it on the days it doesn't seem to be making any difference. You make it on the hard days the same as the easy ones, and you don't get to decide when you've done enough of it, because that's not how it works." She paused. "Can you do that?" Brandon looked at her. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I want to try mine." Rae pulled an empty chair around to the working side of the desk. "Then start now," she said. "There's work to do." He sat down beside her. That same morning, Doc Harmon came by at 10 with coffee and 2 cups from Cedar Road, and they stood outside the office in the November light, which was thin and clear, the way Nevada light gets in the late fall, stripped of the summer's diffusion and left with something direct and clean. Doc handed Rae her cup, and they stood there for a while, not saying anything, the way old friends stand, when the being together is sufficient and the talking is optional. Rae's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. The text was brief and direct. "Ms. Decker, my name is Patricia Hadley. I'm being pushed out of my home by a developer who's been making things very difficult for everyone on my block. A neighbor told me what you did in Henderson last year. I don't know if you help with situations like this or if this is even the right number, but I didn't know where else to turn." Rae read it twice. She looked up at the desert, at the long, flat reach of it beyond the buildings of the town, at the sky above which was enormous and full of light. She thought about her mother in her kitchen, with the bracelet on her wrist and her coffee, and the slow, comfortable morning of a woman who had stopped being afraid to live her life. She thought about Earl Pittman in his shop turning wrenches, doing the honest work. About Mabel Thornton's grandchildren visiting every Sunday now. About the photographs on the walls of Cedar Road Diner, all the men and women who had stood up when it mattered. She thought about the road ahead, which was long and uncertain and full of people who needed what she knew how to do. She typed back, "Where and when?" "I'll be there." She pocketed the phone. Doc looked at her with the expression of a man who has known someone long enough to read the answer before the question is finished. "Same as always," he said. "Same as always," Rae said. She finished her coffee. She went inside and told Brandon to pull up a chair and pay attention because there was work to do, and someone needed to learn how to do it, and the learning was going to take everything Brandon had to give, which was exactly what it was supposed to take. He pulled up the chair. He did not look like a man who was waiting for an easier assignment. That was enough. Across town, Helen Decker sat at the window of her house with her coffee and the morning paper, and on her wrist the silver bracelet caught the November light and held it. 3 names in the metal. 3 generations of women who had come through hard things and kept coming, who had been afraid and stood anyway, who had held on to each other and to the things that mattered, and had found in the holding that the things worth keeping were the things worth fighting for. The bracelet had been through everything and had come back the way things come back when someone refuses to stop looking for them. When someone decides that the cost of looking is worth whatever the finding costs. Helen looked up at the sound of a motorcycle engine in the distance growing louder, the familiar voice of the Harley Road King that her daughter had owned since 1995 and intended to own until one or the other of them stopped working, which at the rate they were both going would be a very long time from now. The sound swelled and then faded as Rae turned onto the far road, heading somewhere she was needed, doing the only thing she had ever known how to do when it mattered. Helen watched until she could no longer hear the engine. Then she smiled and turned back to her coffee and her morning, the bracelet warm against her skin, the 3 names still there, still clear, still hers. Outside, old Route 66 ran straight and weathered through the Nevada desert, the same road it had always been scarred and repaired, bypassed, and returned to, carrying on the way. Roads carry on when the people who built them are long gone, but the miles remain. The Cedar Road Diner sat at its familiar bend, the neon sign flickering as it had flickered since 1987. Still broken, still going, still throwing its imperfect light out into the October dark. Some things refuse to stop. Some things keep their names through everything. The road went on. The fight went on. And somewhere on that road, a woman on a Harley-Davidson rode toward the next thing that needed doing, carrying nothing but what she had earned and everything that mattered, and the Nevada morning opened up ahead of her like a promise that intended to be kept. People ask what makes a person stand up when standing costs everything. They look for the answer in the battles. They think the answer is in the fighting itself. It isn't. The answer is in the morning after, in the choice to rise and go again, in the understanding that the people who needed protecting yesterday still need protecting today, and that having protected them once does not retire the obligation, it only clarifies it. Rae Decker rode on. The desert held her. And somewhere behind her in a diner on old Route 66, a silver bracelet caught the morning light. 3 names, 3 generations, still there.